The evidence bag hit the table with a sound that echoed through the marble courtroom, like a judge's gavel. Inside, wrapped in clear plastic that caught the fluorescent lights, sat 3 ounces of pure cocaine, street value roughly $6,000, legal consequence up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The jury leaned forward in their seats, 12 faces arranged in judgment, already calculating guilt before the prosecution had finished their opening statement. At the defendant's table, Naomi Carter sat with her hands folded, her tailored charcoal suit pressed to perfection, her expression as calm as still water. She was a black woman in her mid-30s with natural hair pulled back in a simple bun, minimal jewelry, and eyes that seemed to process everything in the room simultaneously. While her court-appointed attorney shuffled papers with trembling hands, Naomi's gaze drifted to the witness bench where officers Derek Hastings and Kyle Morrison sat in their dress blues, badges polished to a mirror shine, smirks barely concealed behind professional masks. They thought they'd won. The evidence seemed irrefutable. The narrative was clean. The outcome was predetermined. What none of them realized, not the officers, not the jury, not even the prosecutor who arranged his notes with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case this straightforward, was that everything happening in that courtroom was exactly what Naomi Carter had been waiting for. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't bad luck or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a provocation. And she was about to respond. But before we get to the moment that changed everything, before we see how a routine traffic stop became a federal case that would dismantle an entire network of corruption, I need to tell you how we got here. This is a story about justice delayed but not denied, about a system that preys on the vulnerable, and about what happens when the hunters realize too late that they've trapped a predator. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began, 3 weeks before that courtroom detonated. The streetlights of Harrington Hills cast long shadows across manicured lawns that stretched like green oceans between houses that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. It was the kind of neighborhood where silence wasn't just preferred. It was enforced through homeowners associations, private security, and police who responded to calls about suspicious persons within minutes. The streets were named after trees that had been cleared to build the development: Elm Ridge Drive, Oak Valley Court, Magnolia Terrace. Irony wasn't a concept that troubled the developers. Naomi Carter's rental car, a modest gray Honda Accord that blended into traffic like camouflage, turned onto Whitmore Lane at exactly 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening in late October. She'd chosen the timing deliberately, late enough that most residents had retreated behind their security systems and blackout curtains, early enough that her presence wouldn't trigger immediate alarm. She drove the speed limit precisely, used her turn signals religiously, and kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. She was here for surveillance, though not the kind anyone would suspect. For the past 6 months, Naomi had been tracking patterns of police behavior in affluent neighborhoods across 3 counties, documenting response times, citation rates, and the demographics of people stopped by law enforcement in areas where they supposedly didn't belong. The data was damning, but data alone wouldn't move a jury. She needed something visceral, something that would make comfortable people uncomfortable, something that would force a system to look at itself in a mirror it couldn't ignore. She needed to become the evidence. The red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror before she'd traveled 2 blocks. Naomi's heartbeat remained steady as she checked her mirrors, activated her turn signal, and pulled to the curb with textbook precision. Through her driver's side mirror, she watched 2 officers exit their patrol car with the casual confidence of men who'd done this thousands of times. The taller one, she would later learn his name was Derek Hastings, adjusted his duty belt as he approached, one hand resting on his service weapon, not because he expected danger, but because the gesture itself was a form of communication. I have power here, and you don't. His partner, Kyle Morrison, shorter and stockier with a neck that had disappeared into his shoulders years ago, circled to the passenger side of her vehicle, flashlight already drawn, already searching. Naomi rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, war-gamed every possible variation, prepared responses for scenarios that ranged from professional courtesy to outright hostility. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the boredom in Officer Hastings' eyes when he finally reached her window. The look of someone going through motions so routine they'd become muscle memory. "Evening, ma'am." His drawl carried the weight of southern roots transplanted to suburban sprawl. "License and registration, please." "Of course, officer." Naomi's voice was measured, polite, with just enough deference to avoid seeming confrontational. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "I was maintaining the speed limit and using all proper signals." Hastings' jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his professional facade. People who looked like Naomi weren't supposed to ask questions in neighborhoods like this. They were supposed to comply, apologize for existing in spaces they hadn't earned access to, and accept whatever consequences came their way. "Your left taillight is out," he said, the lie sliding out so smoothly it had clearly seen frequent use. "That's a violation of State Traffic Code Section 12-15. License and registration. Now, please." Naomi knew her taillight worked perfectly. She'd checked it 30 minutes before entering the neighborhood. She also knew that arguing the point would escalate the situation in ways that would derail her larger purpose. So she reached slowly toward her glove compartment, narrating each movement like a nature documentary. "I'm reaching for my glove compartment now to retrieve my registration. My license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'll need to reach across to get it." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Morrison barked from the passenger side. His flashlight trained on the interior of her car with an intensity that suggested he expected to find weapons, drugs, or bodies stuffed under the seats. The search for her documents took less than 30 seconds, but Hastings made her wait nearly 10 minutes before returning to her window. During that time, Naomi watched in her mirror as both officers conferred by their patrol car, occasionally glancing back at her vehicle, occasionally speaking into their radios. She knew what they were doing, running her information through every database they had access to, hoping for warrants, priors, unpaid parking tickets, anything that would justify escalation. They would find nothing. Naomi Carter's record was so clean, it practically sparkled. When Hastings finally returned, his expression had shifted from bored routine to something harder, more focused. Morrison stayed by the patrol car, hand on his weapon, body language suggesting a threat that didn't exist. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Naomi's pulse quickened slightly, not from fear but from recognition. This was it. This was the moment where the script diverged from minor traffic citation to something darker. She'd studied hundreds of similar incidents, watched body camera footage until she could recite the dialogue from memory, interviewed victims whose lives had been upended by these exact words delivered in this exact tone. "Officer, is that really necessary for a broken taillight? I'd be happy to get it fixed first thing tomorrow morning." "Step out of the vehicle. Now." Hastings' hand moved to his weapon, not drawing it but making the threat explicit. "This isn't a negotiation." Naomi complied, moving slowly, keeping her hands visible, maintaining the calm demeanor that came from knowing, with absolute certainty, that every moment was being recorded by 3 separate devices she'd hidden on her person and in her vehicle. The devices were FBI-grade, virtually undetectable, and had been activated the moment those red and blue lights appeared in her mirror. The October air carried a chill that made her glad for the light jacket she'd worn, navy blue, professional, with pockets deep enough to conceal the micro-recorder that looked like an ordinary phone. Her boots, flat, comfortable, appropriate for extended surveillance, touched the pavement as she stood beside her car, hands at her sides, waiting for the next move in a choreography she'd studied but never before performed. "Place your hands on the hood of the vehicle and spread your feet apart," Hastings commanded, already moving into her personal space, already treating her like someone who'd committed crimes she hadn't been accused of yet. Naomi complied, feeling the warmth of the hood against her palms, feeling the vulnerability of the position, feeling the rage that she'd trained herself to channel into focus. Behind her, she heard Morrison approaching, heard his leather duty belt creaking, heard the subtle electronic chirp of a body camera that might or might not be recording properly. These devices had a tendency to malfunction at convenient moments. The pat-down was thorough to the point of harassment, hands lingering in places that had nothing to do with officer safety and everything to do with humiliation. Naomi kept her breathing steady, kept her expression neutral, kept her mind cataloging every violation of proper procedure for the report she would eventually file. "Vehicle seems awful clean for someone just driving through the neighborhood," Morrison observed, his voice carrying a sneer that suggested cleanliness itself was suspicious when exhibited by certain people. "What brings you to Harrington Hills tonight, Ms. Carter?" "I was visiting a friend," Naomi replied, the lie prepared weeks in advance, complete with a name, address, and backstory that would check out if investigated. "I'm headed home now." "Uh-huh." Hastings exchanged a glance with his partner, some unspoken communication that decades of working together had refined into a language all its own. "Well, I think we're going to need to search your vehicle. Make sure everything's in order." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Officer, I haven't given you consent to search my vehicle, and unless you have probable cause, your nervousness gives me probable cause," Hastings interrupted, his smile thin and sharp as a blade. "Your presence in a neighborhood you don't belong in gives me probable cause. Your refusal to cooperate gives me probable cause. Now, we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice." This was the decision point, the moment where most people, especially people who looked like Naomi, who'd been taught from childhood that arguing with police was dangerous, potentially fatal, would back down, would allow the violation, would pray it ended with just humiliation and not violence. But Naomi Carter had been preparing for this moment for months. She had federal authorization, she had legal backup on speed dial, and most importantly, she had evidence-gathering equipment that was capturing every word, every gesture, every violation of her constitutional rights. "I do not consent to a search," she said clearly, loudly enough for every recording device to capture. "I have not committed any crime. I have complied with every lawful order. I am explicitly stating that I do not consent to any search of my person or property." The air seemed to crystallize around them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove past on the main road, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding on this quiet suburban street. Hastings' expression went cold. "Have it your way." What happened next unfolded with the practiced efficiency of a magic trick: misdirection, sleight of hand, and a reveal that would seem impossible if you didn't know how the illusion worked. Morrison moved to the driver's side of Naomi's vehicle, while Hastings kept her positioned at the rear, his body blocking her view of what his partner was doing. She heard the door open, heard sounds of movement, heard the rustle of items being shifted. Through the reflection in her car's window, she caught fragmented glimpses of Morrison's hands moving under the front seat, reaching into the glove compartment she'd already opened for her registration, disturbing the careful organization she'd maintained. "Well, well, well," Morrison's voice carried theatrical surprise that didn't reach his eyes. "What do we have here?" He emerged from the vehicle holding a clear plastic bag that caught the streetlight like a trophy. Inside, white powder pressed against the plastic and a brick that looked exactly like what it was supposed to be: cocaine, packaged for distribution, worth thousands on the street, worth years in prison if found in someone's possession. Naomi's heart should have been racing. She should have been terrified, panicked, already calculating which family members could post bail, which public defender might take her case seriously, how many years of her life were about to disappear into the prison system. Instead, she felt something close to satisfaction. Because that cocaine hadn't been in her car 30 seconds ago. She knew it with absolute certainty because she'd prepared this vehicle personally, had documented its contents with photographs and video, had ensured that nothing illegal, nothing incriminating, nothing that could justify what was about to happen existed anywhere in or around that Honda Accord, which meant these officers had just planted evidence, and every second of it was being recorded in high definition from 3 different angles. "That's not mine," Naomi said, her voice steady, her words chosen carefully for the jury that would eventually hear them. "I have never seen that substance before. Whatever you just removed from my vehicle, you put there yourself." "Is that right?" Hastings' smile widened, showing teeth that looked too white under the streetlights. "That's what they all say. Kyle, you got a witness to this discovery?" "Clear as day, partner." Morrison was already pulling his handcuffs free, already advancing on Naomi with the confidence of someone who'd performed this particular choreography dozens, maybe hundreds of times. "Saw it with my own eyes, tucked right under the driver's seat. Plain view doctrine applies." The handcuffs were cold against Naomi's wrists, the ratcheting sound obscenely loud in the quiet neighborhood. She didn't resist. Resistance would give them justification for violence, and violence would complicate the case she was building. Instead, she went limp, forcing them to support her weight, forcing them to work for the arrest they'd manufactured. "You have the right to remain silent," Hastings began, reciting Miranda rights with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words washed over Naomi like white noise. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, already planning the legal strategy that would turn this arrest into a federal case, already cataloging the mistakes these officers were making, because they were making plenty. They didn't know she was FBI trained. They didn't know she specialized in civil rights violations. They didn't know that every humiliation they were about to inflict, every procedural corner they were about to cut, every piece of evidence they were about to falsify was being recorded by equipment that would hold up in federal court. They thought she was just another black woman in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time, someone they could process through the system like they'd processed hundreds before her, someone who wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back, someone whose word would never outweigh a police officer's testimony in front of a jury. They had no idea who they'd actually pulled over. The patrol car's back seat smelled like industrial cleaner, failing to mask the scent of human fear and bodily fluids that had soaked into the vinyl over years of use. Naomi sat with her hands cuffed behind her back, the position deliberately uncomfortable, designed to reinforce powerlessness. Through the metal grating that separated front from back, she could hear Hastings and Morrison talking in low voices, occasionally laughing, clearly congratulating themselves on what they believed was another successful interdiction of drugs in their patrol zone. "That's got to be what, our 5th this month?" Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he was doing important work. 6, actually. Hastings tapped something on the dashboard computer. "Johnson's going to be pleased. We're way ahead of last quarter's numbers. Think this one'll lawyer up?" "They always say they will. Never do. Public defender will talk her into a plea. She'll do 3 to 5. We move on to the next one." Naomi memorized every word, every tone, every casual admission that this was routine, that she was part of a pattern, that other people had been processed through this same machinery of injustice. Her attorneys, the real ones, not the public defender these officers assumed would handle her case, would love that conversation. The drive to the precinct took 15 minutes through streets that grew progressively less affluent, transitioning from Harrington Hills' manicured perfection to neighborhoods where streetlights worked intermittently and corner stores had bars on their windows. The station itself was a brutalist concrete structure from the 1970s, all right angles and small windows, designed to project authority rather than serve the community. Processing took 2 hours. They made her stand against a height chart for booking photos, the flash leaving spots in her vision. They rolled her fingers across an electronic pad for prints, the gel cold and sticky. They inventoried her belongings with theatrical thoroughness, making a show of examining her phone, which contained nothing incriminating because she kept all sensitive materials on encrypted devices hidden elsewhere. Her wallet, which contained exactly $73 in cash and credit cards under her real name, and her jacket, which contained the micro recorder they never thought to look for because it looked exactly like an ordinary phone. The holding cell was 8 by 10 feet, concrete walls covered in scratched graffiti that documented decades of human misery, phone numbers of lawyers who might or might not still practice, declarations of innocence that no one with power would ever read, crude drawings of anatomy and profanity that served as the only available form of protest. Naomi sat on the metal bench bolted to the wall and waited. This was the part she dreaded most. Not the arrest, not the humiliation of being processed like a criminal, but the waiting. The hours alone with nothing but her thoughts and the crushing weight of a system designed to break people before they ever reached a courtroom. She thought about the others who'd sat in this cell, people who didn't have federal connections or hidden recordings, people who would take plea deals because fighting seemed impossible, people whose lives would be permanently altered by arrest just like this one. The anger she'd been channeling into focus began to heat her from the inside out. Around 2 a.m., a different officer, younger, with eyes that still held some capacity for doubt, escorted her to a phone. She was allowed one call, though technically she was entitled to more since she hadn't been formally charged yet. The system worked on technicalities, but it also worked on assumptions, and everyone assumed she'd call a family member, a friend, someone who would post bail and get her out while she waited for her court date weeks or months in the future. Instead, Naomi dialed a number she'd memorized years ago, a number that connected directly to a specific department within the FBI's Civil Rights Division, a number that was answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "Raven," she said simply, using the code word they'd established. "The trap is sprung." The voice on the other end, calm, professional, belonging to her handler, Agent Marcus Webb, confirmed receipt. "Understood. Recording devices?" "All active and functional. I have everything." "Then we wait for trial. Can you handle it?" Naomi looked around the stark hallway, at the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, at the infrastructure of a justice system that had learned to process human beings like an assembly line. "I can handle it." "Good. Don't break cover. Let them think they've won. The real fight starts in court." The call ended, and Naomi was escorted back to her cell. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep with adrenaline and purpose coursing through her veins. Instead, she sat in the darkness and reviewed everything that had happened, every word spoken, every action taken, building the narrative in her mind that would eventually be presented to a jury. At 7 a.m., a guard she hadn't seen before appeared at her cell. "Naomi Carter, you made bail." Bail. She hadn't arranged for bail because she'd assumed she'd be held until arraignment. Someone else had intervened, had put up the money, had expedited paperwork that normally took days. The FBI was moving faster than she'd expected, which meant they were confident in the evidence, confident in the case, confident that when the time came to reveal what was really happening, the impact would be devastating. The processing out took another hour. More paperwork, more waiting, more theatrical displays of bureaucratic efficiency that existed primarily to intimidate and exhaust. When she finally stepped into the morning sunlight, squinting against the brightness after hours in artificial light, a black SUV was waiting at the curb. Agent Webb was driving. He was a man in his late 40s with gray threading through his hair and a face that had learned to reveal nothing. Beside him in the passenger seat was Rachel Chen, the attorney who would officially represent Naomi, but who was actually part of a federal task force that had been building a case against corrupt law enforcement in this region for over 2 years. "Get in," Webb said, as soon as Naomi opened the rear door. "We need to debrief before your arraignment this afternoon." The SUV pulled into traffic, blending seamlessly with the morning commute. In the back seat, Naomi finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had been building since the moment those red and blue lights appeared in her mirror. "The recordings?" Chen asked without preamble. Attorneys like her didn't waste time on comfort or sympathy. There would be time for that after they'd won. "Perfect quality." All 3 devices captured the entire encounter from initial stop through arrest. You can clearly see Morrison planting the evidence, hear both officers discussing their quota system, hear them acknowledging this is standard procedure. Webb's hands tightened on the steering wheel, the only sign of the fury that Naomi knew he kept carefully controlled. Marcus Webb had spent 23 years in the FBI, 15 of those focusing on civil rights violations, and he'd seen enough cases like this to understand exactly how the system worked and exactly what it took to dismantle it. "The cocaine they planted," he said. "Was it from evidence lockup?" "Almost certainly. I caught a glimpse of the evidence bag. Had a case number written on it in permanent marker. Sloppy work." "Good. Chen, make sure we subpoena their evidence logs for the past 2 years. I want to know every case those officers have worked, every arrest they've made, every time they've discovered drugs in someone's vehicle." Chen was already typing notes on her tablet. "The pattern will be clear. Minorities in affluent neighborhoods, small amounts of drugs, plea deals that avoid trial. They've been running this play for years." Naomi closed her eyes, letting the vehicle's motion soothe her frayed nerves. "How many others have they done this to?" "Based on preliminary data?" Webb glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. "At least 43 arrests in the past 18 months that fit the same profile. Probably more if we go back further. And that's just Hastings and Morrison. This precinct has 6 other officers working the same neighborhoods with similar arrest patterns. 43 people. 43 lives disrupted, potentially destroyed, by officers who'd turned law enforcement into a numbers game where minorities in the wrong neighborhoods became easy targets for manufactured arrests. We're going to burn them down, Chen said, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd built a career on cases like this. Every single one of them. But we need you to stay strong through trial. They're going to come at you hard, attack your credibility, your character, everything. The prosecutor assigned to your case is Jack Brennan, and he's got an 87% conviction rate because he plays dirty. Let him, Naomi replied. I've been playing the long game for 6 months. A few more weeks won't break me. The SUV pulled into an underground garage beneath a nondescript office building downtown. This was FBI territory, a safe space where they could debrief without risk of surveillance or interference. Over the next 3 hours, Naomi told her story again and again, each time adding details she'd remembered, each time refining the narrative that would eventually be presented in court. They reviewed the recordings, watching the footage from multiple angles, seeing Morrison's hand slip under the front seat with the evidence bag already in his palm, seeing Hastings position himself to block Naomi's view, seeing the entire orchestrated performance that would have sent an innocent woman to prison for years. Jury's gonna lose their minds when they see this, Webb observed, watching Morrison's hand emerge with the cocaine for the 4th time. This is so blatant, it's almost insulting. That's the point, Chen replied. They've done it so many times without consequences that they've gotten sloppy. They don't even try to hide it anymore because they don't believe they'll ever face accountability. The arraignment that afternoon was perfunctory. Naomi stood before a judge who looked like she'd been processing criminal cases for 30 years without actually seeing the human beings who stood in her courtroom. The charges were read: possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, carrying a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years. Naomi pled not guilty with a voice that carried through the courtroom clearly enough to be heard in the gallery, where she knew reporters had started to gather. Word of a clean-cut professional black woman arrested in Harrington Hills had already begun circulating through social media, already beginning to raise questions about profiling and police conduct. Bail was set at $50,000, high for a first offense, but not unusual given the quantity of drugs allegedly found. Chen argued for reduction, citing Naomi's clean record and professional standing, but the prosecutor, Jack Brennan, with his silvering hair and suit that cost more than most public defenders made in a month, painted Naomi as a flight risk and potential danger to the community. The judge sided with Brennan, and Naomi walked out of the courthouse with an ankle monitor that would track her movements until trial. 3 weeks, Chen said as they reached the courthouse steps. Trial starts in 3 weeks. Use the time to rest, prepare mentally for what's coming. This is going to be brutal. Naomi looked up at the courthouse behind them, at the marble columns and the words "Equal Justice Under Law." Carved above the entrance, words that meant everything and nothing depending on who you were and what you looked like. I'm ready, she said. I've been ready for this my entire life. Over the next 3 weeks, the case began to take on a life of its own. Social media exploded with commentary from people who'd never met Naomi, but recognized the pattern. Black woman in wrong neighborhood, traffic stop for dubious reasons, drugs mysteriously discovered. The story hit local news, then regional, then national outlets that saw in Naomi's case a reflection of a larger problem with law enforcement and racial profiling. Hastings and Morrison were placed on administrative leave, a standard procedure that would eventually become permanent when the full extent of their corruption emerged. The police union issued statements supporting their officers, claiming that Naomi's arrest was legitimate and that any suggestion of misconduct was an attack on law enforcement generally. Defense attorneys across the state began reviewing past cases involving the 2 officers, looking for patterns that might overturn convictions, searching for other victims who'd been too scared or too poor to fight back. And through it all, Naomi maintained her routine. She went to work at her cover job, a position at a nonprofit that actually served as her FBI office for this deep cover operation. She wore her ankle monitor without complaint. She met with Chen twice a week to prepare for testimony, rehearsing answers to questions that would be designed to break her, to make her angry, to make her look like someone who deserved what had happened. They're going to ask about every mistake you've ever made, Chen warned during one session. Every speeding ticket, every college party, every relationship that ended badly. Brennan specializes in character assassination, in making juries forget that the defendant is actually the victim. Let him dig, Naomi replied. He won't find anything that matters. He'll also try to make the jury sympathize with the officers. He'll paint them as dedicated public servants doing a difficult job, men with families who were just following their training, who had reason to be suspicious of someone who didn't belong in that neighborhood. The recordings don't care about sympathy. They show exactly what happened. Recordings can be dismissed as misleading, taken out of context, edited to show only part of the story. We need you to be perfect on the stand, calm, credible, sympathetic. Don't give him any ammunition to use against you. The night before trial, Naomi stood in her apartment looking at the clothes she'd laid out for the next day. Conservative business attire that would signal professionalism without seeming like she was trying too hard. Minimal jewelry that wouldn't distract. Low heels that would let her stand comfortably through what might be hours of testimony. Her phone buzzed with a text from Webb. "Ready for tomorrow?" She typed back, "More than ready. Time to spring the trap." But because that's what this had always been, a trap, carefully baited and set, waiting for the moment when it would close around the officers who'd thought they were the hunters. Tomorrow, in that courtroom where the jury had already formed opinions based on incomplete information, where the prosecutor believed he had an easy conviction, where two corrupt officers sat smirking at their witness bench. Tomorrow, everything would change. Naomi set her alarm, turned off her lights, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She didn't pray. Prayer seemed inadequate for what was coming. Instead, she thought about the 43 people who'd been victims before her, about the lives disrupted and dreams deferred, about a system that had learned to process injustice so efficiently it had become routine. She thought about justice, real justice, the kind that didn't just punish individuals but changed systems, that didn't just win cases but prevented future victims. And she smiled in the darkness, because tomorrow, finally, after months of preparation, the real work would begin. The trap was set. The prey was confident. The recordings were secure. All that remained was to watch what happened when the truth became impossible to deny. The courthouse steps were already crowded when Naomi arrived at 7:30 the next morning, a full hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers reaching for signal, reporters doing sound checks and reviewing notes, while cameramen adjusted their equipment. Chen had warned her this would happen. High-profile cases attracted media attention like blood in water attracted sharks, but seeing it in person was different from imagining it. "Keep your head up," Chen murmured as they approached the building, her hand light on Naomi's elbow. "Don't say anything to the press. Let your testimony speak for itself." Naomi nodded, focusing on the courthouse doors ahead, on the marble steps that had been worn smooth by decades of feet climbing toward justice, or judgment, or something in between. Questions flew at her from every direction, microphones thrust forward like weapons, voices overlapping into incomprehensible noise. "Ms. Carter, do you think you were racially profiled? Do you have a statement about the officers who arrested you? Are you seeking a settlement from the police department?" Chen navigated through them with practiced ease, her briefcase cutting a path like the bow of a ship through turbulent waters. They passed through security, through metal detectors that beeped unnecessarily even after Naomi had removed everything from her pockets, through corridors that smelled like industrial cleaner, and the peculiar mustiness that seemed to inhabit all old government buildings. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, its wood paneling dark with age, its benches scarred from decades of nervous hands gripping the armrests. The jury box sat empty for now, 12 seats waiting to be filled by 12 people who would decide whether Naomi Carter was a criminal who deserved punishment or a victim who deserved justice. The judge's bench loomed above everything else, positioned to reinforce the hierarchy of power that courtrooms embodied. The judge above all, the witness stand below, and to the side. The defendants' and prosecutors' tables equal in position, if not in actual power. Naomi took her seat beside Chen at the defense table, arranging her notepad and water glass with unnecessary precision, giving her hands something to do while her mind raced through everything they'd prepared, every possible scenario they'd rehearsed, every trap that Brennan might lay during his examination. At the prosecution's table, Jack Brennan was conferring with his assistant, a younger man whose expensive suit didn't quite fit his nervous energy. Brennan himself was everything Chen had described. Silver hair, perfectly styled, suit tailored to hide the paunch that middle age had given him, face arranged in an expression of absolute confidence that came from years of winning cases that should have been losses. He glanced over at Naomi once, his eyes assessing her the way a butcher might assess a cut of meat, calculating exactly where to make the incisions that would be most effective. Behind the prosecution table, Officers Hastings and Morrison sat in their dress uniforms, medals polished, faces composed into expressions of respectful seriousness. They looked like heroes, like men who dedicated their lives to public service, like anyone except what they actually were. Hastings caught Naomi's eye and smiled. Not a friendly smile, but something predatory, something that said he still believed this would end with her conviction and their vindication. The gallery began filling as 8 o'clock approached. Naomi recognized Agent Webb sitting 3 rows back, his presence a reminder that this case extended far beyond this courtroom, that federal investigators were watching and documenting everything that happened here. She saw reporters with notebooks, legal observers from civil rights organizations, and faces she didn't recognize but could categorize. Supporters who believed in her innocence, skeptics who believed in the police, and the curious who just wanted to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. At precisely 8 o'clock, the bailiff called the courtroom to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison. The judge who entered was a black woman in her late 50s, her face lined with the kind of weariness that came from decades of seeing humanity at its worst. She took her seat with economical movements, arranging her robe and reviewing papers before looking up at the assembled courtroom. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying authority without needing volume. "We're here for the matter of the state versus Naomi Carter, case number CR 2024-8847. Are both parties ready to proceed?" "Ready for the prosecution, Your Honor," Brennan said, standing with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his welcome in spaces like this. "Ready for the defense," Chen replied, her voice matching his for confidence, even if she couldn't match his courtroom experience. "Then let's begin with jury selection." The process took most of the morning. Potential jurors filed in, were questioned about their backgrounds and biases, were dismissed for cause or through peremptory challenges as both sides attempted to craft a jury that would be sympathetic to their narrative. Brennan wanted jurors who trusted law enforcement, who believed in the system, who would see a bag of cocaine and assume guilt regardless of how it had been discovered. Chen wanted jurors who could question authority, who understood systemic bias, who would be willing to believe that police officers could lie and plant evidence. They ended up with 12 people who represented a cross-section of the county, 6 women and 6 men, ranging from a retired school teacher to a software engineer to a grocery store manager. 5 were white, 4 were black, 2 were Latino, 1 was Asian. Their faces revealed nothing about their thoughts, their biases, their willingness to believe one side over the other. By the time they were sworn in and seated, it was nearly noon. Judge Morrison called a recess for lunch, instructing everyone to return at 1:30 for opening statements. "What do you think?" Naomi asked Chen as they found a quiet corner in the courthouse cafeteria, away from reporters and curious onlookers. Chen picked at her salad without enthusiasm. "The jury's about as good as we could hope for. The retired teacher, Mrs. Patterson, she's going to be key. I saw how she looked at those officers, like she was already skeptical. If we can win her over, she'll influence the others during deliberations." "And the software engineer, the young guy in the back row?" "David Chen, no relation," she added with a slight smile. "He's tech-savvy, which means he'll understand the recording equipment, won't be suspicious of digital evidence. That works in our favor." Naomi pushed food around her plate without eating. Her stomach was too tight for food, too full of anticipation and carefully controlled anxiety. "Brennan's going to come out swinging in his opening statement. Let him. The harder he pushes the narrative that you're a drug dealer, the more devastating it'll be when we prove you're not." At 1:30, they reconvened in the courtroom. The jury filed back in, taking their assigned seats with the self-consciousness of people who knew they were being watched, who understood that their reactions and expressions would be analyzed by lawyers and defendants and everyone else trying to predict the outcome. Judge Morrison looked out over her courtroom with eyes that had seen this drama play out hundreds of times. "Mr. Brennan, you may deliver your opening statement." Brennan stood, buttoning his suit jacket in a gesture that was probably unconscious but looked practiced, and approached the jury box with the kind of easy familiarity that suggested he considered this his natural habitat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice pitched to carry warmth and authority in equal measure. "Thank you for your service. What we're here to discuss today is straightforward. On the night of October 19th, two dedicated police officers, men who've spent a combined 40 years protecting this community, were doing their jobs. They observed a vehicle with a broken taillight in a residential neighborhood. They performed a routine traffic stop, and during that stop, they discovered 3 ounces of pure cocaine hidden in that vehicle. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the jury imagine the scene. Now, the defense is going to try to complicate this simple fact. They're going to talk about racial profiling, about police misconduct, about conspiracies and cover-ups. But I want you to focus on what's real, what's provable, what's undeniable. Officers Hastings and Morrison found drugs in the defendant's vehicle. Those drugs didn't materialize out of thin air. They didn't plant themselves under the driver's seat. Someone put them there, someone was transporting them, and that someone is sitting right there at the defense table. His finger pointed at Naomi without looking at her, the gesture both accusatory and dismissive. Ms. Carter would have you believe that 2 respected officers, men with families and mortgages and unblemished service records, somehow decided on a random Thursday night to destroy their careers by planting drugs on a complete stranger. Does that make sense to you? Does that sound like the behavior of rational men doing a difficult job? Brennan walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn. Or does it make more sense that Ms. Carter, who has no verifiable reason for being in that neighborhood at that time, who became nervous and evasive when questioned, who refused to consent to a search of her vehicle, was transporting illegal narcotics? That's what the evidence will show. That's what Officer Hastings and Officer Morrison will testify to under oath. And that's what I'm confident you'll conclude beyond a reasonable doubt when you've heard all the facts. He returned to his table, satisfied with his performance, confident that he'd framed the narrative in a way that would be difficult to overcome. The jury's faces remained neutral, but Naomi could see the subtle shifts in posture, the way some of them glanced at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion. Judge Morrison looked to the defense table. "Ms. Chen, your opening statement." Chen stood, and in that moment, Naomi saw why Webb had insisted on her as lead counsel. There was something in her bearing, a combination of steel and grace, of absolute confidence tempered by genuine respect for the jury, that commanded attention without demanding it. "Members of the jury," Chen began, her voice quieter than Brennan's but somehow more penetrating, "Mr. Brennan is right about one thing. This case is about what's real, what's provable, what's undeniable. But where he and I differ is in what those facts actually are." She moved away from the defense table, not approaching the jury as aggressively as Brennan had, but creating a sense of intimacy, of sharing a confidence. "You're going to see video evidence in this trial, not secondhand testimony, not he said, she said, but actual video footage from multiple angles showing exactly what happened on the night of October 19th. And what that footage will show you is something that should shock your conscience, something that should make you question everything you've been told about how our justice system operates." Chen's voice grew harder, more focused. "You will see, with your own eyes, Officer Kyle Morrison place a bag of cocaine under the front seat of Ms. Carter's vehicle. You will see his hand enter the car empty and emerge holding evidence that was not there 30 seconds before. You will hear Officers Hastings and Morrison discuss their arrest quota, how Ms. Carter represents their 6th manufactured case that month, how they expect her to take a plea deal like all the others before her. The jury's attention was absolute now. Even the most skeptical faces showed signs of surprise, of uncomfortable recognition that this case might not be as simple as the prosecution claimed. "Ms. Carter is not a drug dealer," Chen continued. "She's never been arrested before this night. She has no criminal record, no history of drug use, no connection to any illegal activity. What she does have is dark skin and the audacity to drive through a neighborhood where someone decided she didn't belong. And for that crime, the crime of existing while black in the wrong zip code, 2 police officers decided to manufacture evidence that would have sent her to prison for 15 to 20 years. Chen let the words hang in the air, let the jury absorb the full weight of what she was alleging. "Mr. Brennan asked you if it makes sense that 2 officers would risk their careers to frame a stranger. Let me ask you a different question. How many times do you think they've done this before and gotten away with it? How many other people are sitting in prison right now because these same officers planted evidence, filed false reports, and testified under oath to crimes that never happened? She returned to the defense table, her hand resting briefly on Naomi's shoulder. By the end of this trial, you won't have to wonder about these questions. You'll have answers, and those answers will leave you with only one possible verdict: not guilty. The opening statements had set the stage, had drawn the battle lines, had given the jury two completely contradictory narratives to consider. Now came the hard part: the presentation of evidence, the examination and cross-examination of witnesses, the slow accumulation of facts that would either prove guilt or demonstrate innocence. Brennan called his first witness, Officer Derek Hastings. Hastings took the stand with the easy confidence of someone who'd testified in court dozens of times, who knew the script and knew how to deliver his lines convincingly. He was sworn in, confirmed his name and badge number, and settled into the witness chair like he owned it. "Officer Hastings," Brennan began, "can you tell the jury what happened on the night of October 19th? "Yes, sir." Hastings directed his answer to the jury, just as he'd been trained. "My partner, Officer Morrison, and I were on patrol in the Harrington Hills neighborhood around 9:45 p.m. We observed a vehicle, a gray Honda Accord, with a broken left tail light, which is a violation of state traffic code. We initiated a traffic stop to address the violation." His voice was calm, professional, carrying just the right note of someone doing a routine job. "When I approached the vehicle, I made contact with the driver, who identified herself as Naomi Carter. I noticed she seemed nervous. Her hands were shaking. She was avoiding eye contact. Her voice was unsteady. Based on my 15 years of experience in law enforcement, these are indicators that something might be wrong." "What happened next?" Brennan prompted, though he clearly knew every word of the answer. "I asked Ms. Carter for her license and registration, which she provided. While my partner ran her information, I observed her behavior more closely. She seemed increasingly agitated, kept looking around as if checking for escape routes. When I asked her to step out of the vehicle, she became argumentative, refused to cooperate fully." Naomi's jaw tightened. Every word was a distortion, every description twisted just enough to transform a calm, compliant interaction into something suspicious and threatening. "Eventually, Ms. Carter did exit the vehicle, and I asked if I could search it. She explicitly refused consent, which is her right, but her nervousness and evasive behavior gave me probable cause to conduct a search anyway, based on reasonable suspicion." "And what did you find during that search?" Brennan asked, though everyone in the courtroom already knew the answer. Officer Morrison discovered a clear plastic bag containing approximately 3 ounces of cocaine hidden under the driver's seat. It was in plain view once the seat was adjusted. We immediately placed Ms. Carter under arrest and transported her to the station for processing. "In your professional opinion, based on 15 years of experience, did Ms. Carter know that cocaine was in her vehicle?" "Objection," Chen called. "Calls for speculation." "Sustained," Judge Morrison ruled. "Rephrase, Mr. Brennan." "Based on Miss Carter's behavior, her nervousness, her refusal to consent to a search, what did you conclude?" "I concluded that she was aware of illegal contraband in her vehicle and was attempting to prevent its discovery." Brennan nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Chen stood for cross-examination, and Naomi could see the subtle change in her bearing. She was a predator now, circling wounded prey, preparing for the kill. "Officer Hastings, you testified that Ms. Carter's left taillight was broken. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And that's why you initiated the traffic stop?" "That's correct." "Did you document this broken taillight? Take a photograph, perhaps?" Hastings shifted slightly. "No, ma'am. That's not standard procedure for minor traffic violations." "I see." "Officer Hastings, when Ms. Carter retrieved her vehicle from the impound lot 3 days after her arrest, that taillight was functioning perfectly. How do you explain that?" "I couldn't say. Perhaps she had it repaired." "From jail? While she was in custody?" Chen's voice carried just enough skepticism to plant doubt. "Remarkable repair service. Let's move on. You testified that Ms. Carter was nervous and evasive. Can you describe specifically what behaviors led you to this conclusion?" "As I said, she was shaking, avoiding eye contact. Her voice was unsteady." Have you considered that a black woman being pulled over by two white police officers in a wealthy neighborhood late at night might have legitimate reasons to be nervous that have nothing to do with guilt? Objection, Brennan called. Argumentative. Withdrawn. Officer Hastings, you said Ms. Carter refused to consent to a search, and you interpreted this as suspicious. Are you aware that refusing a search is a constitutional right? Yes, ma'am, but a yes or no is sufficient. You also testified that her nervousness gave you probable cause to search anyway. Can you point me to the section of your training manual that says nervousness constitutes probable cause? Hastings' professional demeanor was beginning to crack. It's not in the manual per se, but it's part of officer discretion based on experience, and so you made a judgment call based on your interpretation of her emotional state, despite her explicitly refusing consent and despite having no actual evidence of criminal activity. Is that accurate? I had reasonable suspicion based on totality of circumstances. Chen walked to the defense table and picked up a document. This is the police report you filed after Ms. Carter's arrest. In it, you state that Officer Morrison discovered the cocaine in plain view, under the driver's seat. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. Define plain view for the jury, please. Hastings hesitated, recognizing the trap but unable to avoid it. Plain view means the contraband was visible without moving or manipulating anything. So Officer Morrison didn't have to reach under the seat, didn't have to move the seat, didn't have to search for it. He just looked in the car and saw it immediately. He adjusted the seat to see underneath it. Which is it, Officer Hastings? Was it in plain view, or did he have to manipulate the seat to find it? Because those are two very different scenarios legally. He observed something suspicious and adjusted the seat to confirm what he was seeing. What was suspicious about the area under a car seat that would draw his attention to that specific location? Hastings' face was reddening now, frustration breaking through his professional veneer. I don't recall the specific details. You'd have to ask Officer Morrison. Oh, I will, Chen assured him. One more question, Officer Hastings. How many arrests have you made in the Harrington Hills neighborhood in the past 18 months? I don't have exact numbers. Would you be surprised to learn that you and Officer Morrison have made 63 arrests in that neighborhood during that time period, and that 57 of those arrests involved minorities stopped for minor traffic violations who were subsequently found to have drugs in their vehicles? I couldn't confirm those numbers without reviewing records. Would you also be surprised to learn that in 43 of those cases, the defendants took plea deals and never went to trial? Again, I'd have to review, because that's a remarkably high number of drug discoveries in routine traffic stops, wouldn't you say? Almost like someone was placing those drugs there. Objection. Brennan was on his feet. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained. Ms. Chen, ask questions, don't make speeches. No further questions, Your Honor? Hastings left the stand looking less confident than when he'd taken it, his testimony undermined by inconsistencies and questions he couldn't adequately answer. But Brennan still had his second witness, and Officer Morrison's testimony would be crucial. He was the one who'd allegedly discovered the cocaine, whose hands had physically touched the evidence. Morrison took the stand after the afternoon recess, his body language more defensive than Hastings had been. His awareness that this testimony was more dangerous evident in the tension around his eyes and mouth. Brennan walked him through the same narrative: the traffic stop, the nervous suspect, the decision to search, the discovery of cocaine under the driver's seat. Morrison's version matched Hastings' almost word for word, which made sense if they were telling the truth, but looked rehearsed if they were lying. Officer Morrison, can you describe the moment you discovered the cocaine? Brennan asked. Yes, sir. I was conducting a visual search of the vehicle's interior when I noticed something under the driver's seat. I adjusted the seat position to get a better view, and that's when I saw the plastic bag containing what appeared to be cocaine. I immediately alerted my partner and secured the evidence. Was there any doubt in your mind that this was illegal narcotics? No, sir. Based on my training and experience, I recognized it immediately as cocaine packaged for distribution. Thank you, Officer Morrison. No further questions. Chen approached for cross-examination with the same predatory focus she'd shown with Hastings. But this time there was an edge to her voice, a sharpness that suggested she was about to deploy her most devastating weapon. Officer Morrison, you testified that you noticed something under the driver's seat. What specifically did you notice that drew your attention to that location? Morrison paused, thinking through his answer carefully. I saw a corner of the plastic bag protruding from under the seat. A corner of a clear plastic bag in the dark interior of a vehicle, under a seat, at night. You have remarkably good vision, Officer Morrison. I used my flashlight. Of course. And when you saw this corner of a clear plastic bag, what did you think it was? I thought it might be contraband. Based on seeing a corner of clear plastic, that's quite a leap. Tell me, how long did this entire process take, from when you first looked in the car to when you pulled out the cocaine? Maybe 30 seconds? A minute at most. 30 seconds. Interesting. Chen walked back to her table and picked up a remote control. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to present video evidence that has been stipulated to by both parties. Judge Morrison nodded. Proceed. The lights dimmed slightly as a large screen descended from the ceiling. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the video began to play. The footage was crystal clear, shot from inside Naomi's vehicle by one of the hidden cameras. The timestamp in the corner showed the date and time, counting off seconds with digital precision. The audio captured every word spoken by the officers. The jury watched as Morrison approached the passenger side of the vehicle, flashlight in hand. They heard Hastings ordering Naomi to step out. They saw Morrison open the passenger door and lean inside, his body partially blocking the view, but his hands clearly visible in the camera's frame. And then they saw something that made several jurors lean forward in their seats, expressions shifting from neutral observation to shocked recognition. Morrison's hand entered the frame holding a plastic bag that hadn't been there moments before. The camera angle captured him sliding it under the driver's seat with practiced ease, pressing it back into the shadows where it would be discovered seconds later. His other hand held the flashlight, providing the illumination that would make the cocaine visible once he found it. The video played for 45 seconds. In that time, it destroyed the prosecution's case completely. When the lights came back up, the courtroom remained silent. The jury's faces showed a range of emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, betrayal. Morrison sat frozen in the witness chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the armrests hard enough that his knuckles had turned white. Officer Morrison, Chen said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, is that your hand in the video placing cocaine under the driver's seat of Ms. Carter's vehicle? Morrison opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He looked at Brennan desperately, as if the prosecutor could somehow rescue him from the truth that had just been displayed for everyone to see. Answer the question, Officer Morrison, Judge Morrison commanded, her voice hard. That's not... The angle is misleading. It looks like exactly what it is, Chen interrupted. You planted evidence. You framed an innocent woman. You committed a felony on camera because you never imagined you'd be caught. Objection! Brennan finally found his voice, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. Your Honor, this isn't an ambush, Mr. Brennan. This evidence was provided to your office 2 weeks ago as part of discovery. If you chose not to review it carefully, that's not the defense's problem. The judge was staring at the frozen image on the screen, at Morrison's hand clearly visible holding the evidence bag. Mr. Brennan, do you wish to redirect? Brennan looked at Morrison, at the jury, at the video evidence that had just obliterated any chance of conviction. No, Your Honor. The prosecution has no further questions. Then this court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. Judge Morrison's gavel fell like a gunshot. Officer Morrison, you are ordered to remain available for potential perjury charges. Bailiff, please escort the jury out. As the jury filed out, several of them looked back at Naomi with expressions that had transformed from suspicion to sympathy. The gallery erupted into conversation, reporters already typing on their phones, legal observers shaking their heads in disbelief. Naomi sat perfectly still, letting the moment wash over her. This was what 6 months of preparation had been for. This was what sleeping in that cell had been for. This was what wearing an ankle monitor and enduring public scrutiny had been for. The trap had closed, and the hunters had caught themselves. Chen placed her hand on Naomi's arm as the courtroom chaos swirled around them, a gesture that was both congratulation and caution. The video had detonated exactly as they'd planned, but the explosion was still spreading, and there would be shrapnel to dodge before this was over. "Don't celebrate yet," Chen murmured, gathering her papers with practiced efficiency. "Brennan's going to come back tomorrow fighting for his career. He'll try to discredit the video, claim it was edited or taken out of context. We need you ready for the stand." Naomi nodded, watching as Morrison was escorted from the courtroom by 2 bailiffs, his face still bloodless, his posture that of a man who'd just watched his entire life collapse in 45 seconds of high-definition footage. Hastings had disappeared through a side door the moment the judge's gavel fell, probably already calling the police union's lawyers, already constructing whatever defense might salvage something from this wreckage. Agent Webb materialized at their table as the gallery emptied, his expression carefully neutral, despite what Naomi knew had to be satisfaction coursing through him. 23 years of chasing corrupt cops, and he'd just watched 2 of them destroy themselves on camera in open court. "That was cleaner than I expected," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only Naomi and Chen could hear. "But we've got a problem. The police union is already mobilizing. They're calling it entrapment, saying the FBI orchestrated this whole thing to make law enforcement look bad." "Let them try that defense," Chen replied, snapping her briefcase closed. Naomi was acting as a private citizen when she was stopped. The fact that she happens to have federal training doesn't change the illegality of what those officers did. Public opinion doesn't always follow legal logic. There are already posts on social media claiming she's an agent provocateur, that she deliberately targeted good officers to advance some anti-police agenda. Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still flooding her system. "I was pulled over for driving while black in a neighborhood where someone decided I didn't belong. What happened after that was entirely their choice. I didn't plant evidence on myself. I didn't force them to lie in their reports. I didn't make them commit perjury on the stand." Webb studied her with the assessing gaze of someone who'd worked with deep-cover operatives long enough to recognize when stress was approaching critical levels. "How are you holding up? Really?" "I'm fine," Naomi said, though fine was a relative term that encompassed exhaustion, rage, vindication, and a dozen other emotions she'd compartmentalized so effectively she'd almost forgotten they existed. "I knew what I was signing up for when I agreed to this operation. I'll see it through." "The stand tomorrow," Webb said. "That's going to be the hardest part. Brennan's going to go after your credibility, try to make the jury see you as a liar who manipulated her way into creating a false narrative. He'll dig into your background, your training, every decision you've made in the past 5 years. Let him dig. My record is clean." Clean doesn't mean simple. You've worked undercover in 3 different operations. You've used multiple identities. You've lied to targets as part of your job. Brennan will use all of that to suggest you're fundamentally dishonest, that framing innocent officers is exactly the kind of thing someone like you would do. Chen cut in before Naomi could respond. "We've prepared for this. Naomi's testimony will focus on what happened that night, not on her career history. If Brennan tries to delve into classified operations, we'll object, and the judge will sustain. His theatrics won't change what that video shows." The 3 of them left through a side exit that avoided the media scrum on the courthouse steps. Webb's SUV was waiting in a secure parking area, engine running, driver alert. The Bureau wasn't taking chances. Death threats against Naomi had started appearing online within hours of the trial beginning, the usual collection of keyboard warriors and actual threats mixed together in ways that made risk assessment complicated. The drive back to the safe house took 30 minutes through evening traffic that had begun its slow crawl toward gridlock. Naomi watched the city pass by her window, thinking about the people in those cars who had no idea that their justice system was broken in ways both subtle and explicit, that the officers they trusted to protect them sometimes became predators themselves. The safe house was a nondescript townhouse in a middle-class neighborhood where federal agents could blend in without attracting attention. Webb walked them inside, checked the security system, and did a sweep of the rooms even though the house had been secure when they'd left that morning. Old habits, Naomi thought, watching him work. The kind of paranoia that kept undercover agents alive. Get some rest, he said, heading for the door. Chen will be back at 6 a.m. to prep your testimony. The prosecution goes first tomorrow with their rebuttal witnesses. Then you take the stand. It's going to be a long day. After he left, Naomi stood in the kitchen making tea she didn't want, going through the motions of normalcy because the alternative was thinking too hard about what tomorrow would bring. Chen was right that the video evidence was devastating, but cases had been lost on technicalities before. Juries had been swayed by charismatic prosecutors who made them doubt what their own eyes had seen. She was halfway through her tea when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. The preview showed just enough text to make her stomach tighten. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started. Naomi deleted the message without reading the rest and blocked the number. It was the fourth threat she'd received that day, and while the Bureau was tracking them all, there was nothing anyone could do to stop angry strangers from creating new accounts and sending more. That was the price of becoming the face of a movement she hadn't asked to lead, the woman whose arrest had crystallized years of frustration about police misconduct into a single narrative that people could understand. She thought about the 43 people who'd been victims before her, who'd taken plea deals and served time for crimes they didn't commit because they didn't have FBI training or hidden cameras or federal agents backing their defense. She thought about how many of them were still in prison right now, waiting for appeals that might never come, their lives suspended in legal limbo, while the system that had failed them ground forward at glacial pace. That thought kept her awake long after she should have been sleeping, staring at the ceiling of the safe house bedroom, rehearsing answers to questions she hoped Brennan wouldn't ask, but knew he would. Morning arrived with the kind of gray light that suggested rain, clouds hanging low over the city like a warning. Chen appeared at 6 exactly, carrying coffee and a briefcase full of notes that represented hundreds of hours of preparation. "Ready?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Ready or not, the trial would resume in 3 hours. They spent the morning reviewing testimony, Chen playing the role of hostile prosecutor, throwing questions designed to rattle Naomi's composure or catch her in contradictions. They covered her background, her training, the night of her arrest, the decisions that had led to this courtroom confrontation. By the time they left for the courthouse, Naomi's voice was hoarse and her mind felt scraped raw, but she knew her testimony forward and backward. The courthouse steps were even more crowded than the previous day, the media presence having multiplied overnight as news of the video evidence spread. Naomi saw protesters holding signs, some supporting police, some supporting her, the two groups separated by barricades and the nervous presence of courthouse security. Inside, the courtroom had the tense atmosphere of a space where something significant was about to happen. The jury filed in looking more alert than they had during opening statements, their faces showing the kind of engagement that suggested they understood the importance of what they were witnessing. Judge Morrison took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with an expression that suggested she'd spent the previous evening reading case law and departmental regulations, preparing for the legal fireworks she knew were coming. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "call your next witness." Brennan stood, and Naomi could see the change in him from the previous day. The easy confidence had been replaced by something harder, more desperate. He was a man fighting to salvage a case that had turned catastrophic, and desperate men made dangerous opponents. The prosecution calls Dr. Marcus Chen to the stand. The man who walked to the witness stand was in his 50s, balding, with the rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time in laboratories than courtrooms. He was sworn in and stated his credentials: a PhD in digital forensics, 20 years of experience, expert testimony in over 200 cases. "Dr. Chen," Brennan began, "have you had the opportunity to examine the video evidence presented by the defense yesterday?" "I have, yes." "And what are your professional conclusions regarding that video?" Dr. Chen adjusted his glasses, glancing at notes he'd brought with him. "While the video appears to show Officer Morrison placing an object under the vehicle's seat, there are several technical anomalies that suggest the footage may have been edited or manipulated. The timestamp shows minor irregularities. There's a brief pixelation at a crucial moment, and the angle itself is somewhat suspicious, almost as if the camera was positioned specifically to capture this particular action. Naomi felt her jaw tighten, but kept her expression neutral. This was the counterattack Webb had warned about, the attempt to discredit evidence that seemed irrefutable. Are you suggesting the video is not authentic? Brennan asked, his voice carrying renewed confidence. I'm suggesting that without access to the original recording devices and metadata, I cannot verify its authenticity with absolute certainty. The defense has provided copies, not originals, which raises questions about chain of custody and potential tampering. Chen rose for cross-examination with the kind of controlled fury that suggested Dr. Chen's testimony had personally offended her professional integrity. Dr. Chen, you mentioned technical anomalies. Can you quantify those for the jury? Specifically, how many frames of video showed pixelation? Approximately 12 frames during a critical 3-second sequence. And in your expert opinion, would 12 frames out of thousands be consistent with normal digital compression artifacts? Dr. Chen hesitated. It could be, yes. So the anomaly you described is actually completely normal for digital video? Yes or no? In some contexts, yes. And the timestamp irregularity you mentioned, was it off by hours, minutes, milliseconds? Perhaps a tenth of a second at most, which could be caused by the internal clock of the recording device being slightly imprecise, correct? Possibly. Dr. Chen, how much is the police union paying you for your testimony today? Objection! Brennan was on his feet. The witness's compensation is irrelevant. It speaks to bias, Your Honor, Chen countered. This witness is a hired gun who testifies exclusively for law enforcement in cases where video evidence contradicts police testimony. Judge Morrison considered for a moment. I'll allow it. Dr. Chen, please answer the question. Dr. Chen's face reddened. I'm being compensated at my standard rate of $500 per hour. And how many hours have you billed on this case so far? Approximately 20. $10,000 to cast doubt on video evidence that clearly shows what it shows. No further questions. The prosecution called 2 more witnesses, a police supervisor who testified about the integrity of Hastings and Morrison, and another officer who'd worked with them and vouched for their character. Chen's cross-examination of both was brief and brutal, focusing on the fact that neither had been present during Naomi's arrest and therefore had no direct knowledge of what had occurred. By the time Brennan rested his case, it was clear he'd done minimal damage to the defense's narrative. The video remained the centerpiece, and no amount of expert testimony about technical anomalies could erase what the jury had seen with their own eyes. The defense calls Naomi Carter to the stand. This was it. The moment Naomi had been preparing for since the night she'd been pulled over, since the moment those handcuffs had closed around her wrists, since she'd sat in that holding cell and called Webb to activate the operation. She walked to the witness stand with steady steps, placed her hand on the Bible despite her lack of religious belief, and swore to tell the truth. The courtroom felt different from this position. She could see every face in the jury box, could read their expressions, could sense their attention focusing on her with an intensity that was almost physical. Chen approached with a gentleness that was strategic, establishing Naomi as sympathetic before Brennan tried to tear her apart. Ms. Carter, can you tell the jury what you do for a living? I work in civil rights investigation and compliance. And on the night of October 19th, where were you going? I was conducting routine surveillance in the Harrington Hills neighborhood as part of a research project on traffic stop patterns in affluent areas. You were deliberately in that neighborhood as part of your work? Yes. I'd been documenting police activity in several similar neighborhoods over the previous 6 months. What happened when you were pulled over? Naomi took a breath, centering herself before beginning the narrative she'd rehearsed, but that still carried emotional weight even in recitation. I saw police lights in my rearview mirror around 9:47 p.m. I pulled over immediately, placed my hands on the steering wheel, and waited for the officers to approach. Officer Hastings told me my taillight was out, which I knew wasn't true because I'd checked it 30 minutes earlier. She continued through the stop, describing each moment, each interaction, her voice steady but carrying the weight of remembered fear and humiliation. She talked about the pat-down that had crossed from necessary to invasive, about watching Morrison through her car's reflection as he planted the evidence, about the handcuffs and the booking and the hours in the holding cell. Ms. Carter, why didn't you tell the officers that night that you had recording equipment? Because I needed them to proceed as they would have with any other victim. If they'd known they were being recorded, they would have behaved differently. I needed to document their actual practices, not the sanitized version they'd perform for cameras. And when you were arrested, what did you think would happen? I thought justice would be served. I knew I had evidence that would prove my innocence and expose their corruption. I was willing to endure temporary injustice to achieve lasting accountability. Chen returned to her seat, and Naomi braced herself for what came next. Brennan approached like a boxer looking for an opening, his first question coming fast and hard. Ms. Carter, you testified that you work in civil rights investigation. That's a rather vague job description. What exactly does that mean? I investigate patterns of discrimination and civil rights violations. For whom? Naomi paused, knowing this was where things got complicated. I work with various federal agencies on contract. The FBI, specifically, isn't that correct? Among others, yes. And you're trained in undercover operations, evidence gathering, and surveillance techniques? I have received training in those areas, yes. Brennan's smile was sharp. So you're an FBI operative who deliberately put herself in a position to be stopped by police, who recorded the interaction without informing the officers, and who now claims those officers committed crimes. Isn't it possible, Ms. Carter, that you orchestrated this entire scenario to entrap innocent officers doing their jobs? No, Naomi said firmly. I didn't force them to lie about my taillight. I didn't force them to plant drugs in my car. I didn't force them to file false reports and commit perjury. Those were choices they made. But you did deliberately position yourself in that neighborhood hoping to provoke exactly this kind of response, didn't you? You were looking for officers to stop you so you could capture it on camera and claim victimhood. I was documenting patterns of discriminatory traffic stops. Whether I was stopped or not wasn't something I could control. That was entirely up to the officers who decided I didn't belong in that neighborhood based solely on the color of my skin. Or perhaps based on the fact that you were driving slowly through a residential area late at night, which is exactly the kind of behavior that draws police attention regardless of race. I was driving the speed limit using proper signals. The only thing suspicious about my presence was that I'm black. Brennan paced in front of the jury box, letting the silence stretch. Ms. Carter, in your previous undercover operations, how many times have you lied to targets as part of your investigations? Objection, Chen called. Ms. Carter's previous operations are classified and irrelevant to this case. Your Honor, Brennan countered, the witness's credibility is absolutely relevant. If she's lied professionally as part of her job, the jury has a right to know that when evaluating her testimony. Judge Morrison frowned, considering. I'll allow limited questioning about the nature of her work, but nothing that would compromise classified operations. Proceed carefully, Mr. Brennan. Ms. Carter, yes or no? Have you lied to people as part of your undercover work? Naomi met his gaze steadily. I have used cover identities and deceptive statements as authorized by federal law enforcement in pursuit of criminal investigations? Yes. So lying is part of your professional skill set. Operating undercover to catch criminals is part of my professional skill set. That's not the same as lying about material facts in a criminal trial, isn't it? You're asking this jury to believe you over 2 decorated police officers based on video that conveniently shows exactly what you need it to show. How do we know you didn't stage this entire encounter? Naomi's voice grew harder. Because I didn't put cocaine in my own car. I didn't arrest myself. I didn't spend hours in a holding cell by choice. Those officers decided to frame me, and they got caught. The video doesn't lie, Mr. Brennan, and all your theatrics can't change what it shows. No further questions. Brennan sat down looking less satisfied than he'd probably hoped. Naomi returned to the defense table, her hands steady despite the adrenaline crash beginning to set in. Chen called one final witness, a forensic accountant who'd analyzed the evidence logs from the precinct where Hastings and Morrison worked. The accountant testified about irregularities in the chain of custody for numerous drug seizures, about evidence that had been checked out and back in multiple times by the same officers, about patterns that suggested systematic tampering with the evidence room. This data indicates, the accountant concluded, that officers Hastings and Morrison had both means and opportunity to access drugs from the evidence locker and use them in manufactured arrests. The timeline shows they checked out the specific case number that appeared on the bag planted in Ms. Carter's vehicle approximately 1 hour before her traffic stop occurred. The testimony landed like a bomb. Not only had Morrison planted evidence, but he'd stolen it from the department's own evidence room, recycling drugs from previous cases to manufacture new ones. Brennan had no questions for the accountant. What could he ask that wouldn't make things worse? By 4 in the afternoon, both sides had rested their cases. Judge Morrison looked at the clock, then at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments, after which you'll begin your deliberations. Court is adjourned. That evening, Naomi sat in the safe house living room watching news coverage of the trial. Every major network was covering it now, legal experts weighing in on the implications, civil rights leaders calling for investigations into police practices nationwide, and law enforcement unions defending their officers while simultaneously trying to distance themselves from the specific actions caught on camera. Her phone buzzed with a text from Webb. U.S. Attorney's Office is opening a formal investigation into the precinct. They're reviewing every arrest Hastings and Morrison made in the past 5 years. This is bigger than we thought. Bigger than we thought. The word should have brought satisfaction, but instead Naomi felt only exhaustion. She'd achieved what she'd set out to do: expose corruption, create accountability, force the system to confront its own failures. But the cost had been higher than she'd anticipated. The toll on her psyche and her sense of safety more profound than any training manual could have prepared her for. Tomorrow there would be closing arguments. Tomorrow the jury would begin deliberations. Tomorrow, or the day after that, they would render a verdict that would either validate everything she'd sacrificed or suggest that video evidence and sworn testimony still couldn't overcome the institutional bias toward believing police officers over the people they arrested. Naomi pulled up the folder on her laptop containing profiles of the 43 victims who'd come before her. She read their names, studied their faces, memorized their stories. These were the people she was fighting for, the ones who hadn't had cameras or federal backing or the knowledge to fight back. Whatever the jury decided, she'd make sure those people got justice too. The trap had closed on Hastings and Morrison, but the larger system they represented, the quotas, the manufactured arrests, the casual racism that made certain people targets, that system was still intact. Taking down 2 corrupt officers was just the beginning. Naomi understood that now. She'd stumbled into becoming the catalyst for something larger, a reckoning that had been building for years and had finally found a face in a story that people couldn't ignore. Outside, rain began to fall, drops hitting the windows in patterns that sounded almost like applause. Naomi closed her laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the storm, preparing herself for whatever tomorrow would bring. The hardest part was over. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses examined, the truth laid bare for everyone to see. Now came the waiting, the uncertainty, the faith that 12 strangers would see what was obvious and render the only verdict that justice demanded. She thought about Morrison's face when the video played, about the moment his expression shifted from confidence to horror. She thought about Hastings fleeing the courtroom. She thought about Dr. Chen trying to cast doubt on evidence that was beyond dispute. And she thought about how many other officers across how many other cities were still doing what Hastings and Morrison had done, still planting evidence and filing false reports and destroying lives, confident that they'd never face consequences because they never had before. That confidence would be harder to maintain after tomorrow. That certainty that they could act with impunity would be shaken, if not shattered. Naomi finally allowed herself a small smile in the darkness. The trap had worked exactly as designed. Now came the reckoning. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under gray skies that threatened more weather to come. Naomi dressed in the same charcoal suit she'd worn on the first day of trial, understanding the psychology of consistency, of presenting herself as the same calm professional who'd first sat at that defense table while the prosecution painted her as a criminal. She checked her reflection one final time, noting the shadows under her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide, the tension in her jaw that had become permanent over these past weeks. Chen arrived at 6:30 with coffee and a leather portfolio containing the closing argument they'd refined over dozens of drafts. "Last day," she said, though her voice carried none of the relief those words should have brought. They both knew that trials could turn on closing arguments, that juries who seemed convinced could be swayed by a prosecutor's final appeal to their emotions or their biases or their fundamental desire to believe that police officers told the truth. "Brennan's going to go after credibility again," Chen said as they drove through morning traffic toward the courthouse. "He'll try to make the jury forget the video by focusing on you, your training, your deliberate positioning in that neighborhood, the fact that you work for the FBI. He'll suggest that you manipulated the situation to create a false narrative." "The video speaks for itself," Naomi replied, watching the city wake up around them, people heading to jobs and schools and lives that didn't include courtrooms and federal investigations, and the weight of carrying other people's hopes for justice. Video can be recontextualized. That's what he's good at, taking facts that seem irrefutable and spinning them into something else entirely. You need to be prepared for the jury to look at you differently after his closing, to question everything they thought they knew. The courthouse steps were quieter this morning. The media presence reduced now that the dramatic revelation of planted evidence had already been captured and broadcast. The protesters remained, though, their numbers roughly equal on both sides, their signs and chants creating a soundtrack of division that followed Naomi and Chen through security and into the marble corridors beyond. The courtroom felt different today, charged with anticipation and finality. The jury filed in looking serious, their faces showing the weight of responsibility they carried. Whatever they decided in the coming hours would affect not just Naomi's life, but potentially the lives of 43 other people whose cases would be reopened, the careers of officers who'd worked alongside Hastings and Morrison, the public's trust in a system that claimed to deliver equal justice under law. Judge Morrison took her seat precisely at 9 o'clock, her expression revealing nothing of her own thoughts about what she'd witnessed over the past 3 days. "Mr. Brennan, you may deliver your closing argument." Brennan rose slowly, a theatrical pause that drew every eye in the courtroom to him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed genuine, as if he too had been wounded by what this trial had revealed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been a prosecutor for 23 years. I've tried hundreds of cases. I've stood in this courtroom and asked juries to convict people of crimes ranging from theft to murder. And in all that time, I've never had to stand before a jury and say what I'm about to say now." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "This case has shaken my faith in the system I've dedicated my life to serving." The admission seemed to catch the jury off guard. Several leaned forward, curious about where this unexpected opening was leading. "You've seen video evidence that appears to show Officer Morrison planting drugs in Ms. Carter's vehicle. I can't stand here and tell you that's not what it looks like, because it is what it looks like. But what I can tell you is that appearances, even on video, don't always tell the complete story." Brennan walked to the jury box, his voice growing more urgent. "Ms. Carter is an FBI operative trained in deception, surveillance, and evidence manipulation. She deliberately positioned herself in that neighborhood with recording equipment hidden throughout her vehicle. She refused a search knowing it would give the officers grounds to proceed anyway. And then, when things played out exactly as she'd engineered them to, she produced video that makes dedicated public servants look like criminals." He gestured toward where Hastings and Morrison sat, both in dress uniforms, both with expressions of wounded dignity. These men have given a combined 40 years to protecting this community. They've worked holidays and weekends. They've missed their children's birthdays and their anniversaries. They've put themselves in danger every single day to keep you safe. And now they're being destroyed by someone who makes a living out of deceiving people. Naomi felt Chen's hand on her arm, a silent reminder to keep her expression neutral, to not give Brennan anything he could use to suggest she was angry or vindictive or anything except a victim seeking justice. "The defense wants you to believe that Officers Hastings and Morrison are corrupt, that they've been framing innocent people for years, that they stole drugs from an evidence locker to manufacture arrests. But think about what that requires. It requires 2 men with clean service records to suddenly become criminals. It requires an entire precinct to be complicit in their crimes. It requires a conspiracy so vast and so unlikely that the only way it makes sense is if you believe that law enforcement in this city is fundamentally broken." Brennan's voice dropped to something more intimate, more personal. "Or you can believe the simpler explanation. Ms. Carter is an operative who needed a case to advance her career or her agency's agenda. She found 2 officers doing their jobs and manipulated a situation to make them look guilty. The video doesn't show the complete interaction. It doesn't show what happened before the cameras were turned on. It shows exactly what she wanted you to see. Nothing more, nothing less. He returned to his table, his final words delivered with the gravity of a benediction. I'm not asking you to ignore what you saw. I'm asking you to question it, to remember that this defendant is trained to deceive, that she orchestrated this entire scenario, and that two good men's lives hang in the balance based on incomplete evidence presented by someone who profits from destroying trust in law enforcement. That's reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen, and reasonable doubt means you must acquit. He paused, correcting himself with visible difficulty. I mean, you must find for the prosecution. Thank you. The slip was intentional, Naomi realized. A calculated mistake designed to make Brennan seem overwhelmed by the moral complexity of the case, so conflicted that he'd confused prosecution and defense. It was masterful manipulation, and from the jury's faces, some of them had bought it completely. Chen stood for her closing argument, and Naomi could see the steel in her bearing, the absolute conviction that made her formidable in courtrooms across the state. Mr. Brennan just gave you one of the most creative closing arguments I've heard in 15 years of practice. He admitted the video shows what it shows, then asked you to disbelieve your own eyes because the person who recorded it is too competent at her job. He painted Officers Hastings and Morrison as victims of a conspiracy while ignoring the fact that they committed crimes on camera. Chen's voice carried contempt now, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Let me simplify this for you. This case is not complicated. It's not about FBI conspiracies or elaborate entrapment schemes. It's about two police officers who've been planning evidence for years, who finally did it to someone with the resources and knowledge to fight back, and who got caught. She walked to the screen where the video had played, gesturing at it, though no image currently showed. You saw Officer Morrison's hand enter that car holding a bag of cocaine. You saw him place it under the seat. You saw him discover it seconds later. That's not out of context. That's not incomplete. That's a crime, recorded in high definition from multiple angles, with audio that captured both officers discussing their arrest quotas and how they expected Ms. Carter to take a plea deal like all the others before her. Chen's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Mr. Brennan wants you to believe that Ms. Carter somehow forced these officers to commit crimes, but she didn't force them to lie about her taillight. She didn't force them to conduct an illegal search. She didn't force Morrison to reach into an evidence locker, steal cocaine from a previous case, and plant it in her vehicle. Those were choices they made because they've made them before, dozens of times, with victims who didn't have cameras or federal backing or the ability to fight back. She returned to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn. The forensic accountant testified that the cocaine planted in Ms. Carter's car came from their own evidence room. The case number written on that bag connects to a seizure from 18 months ago, which means these officers have been recycling drugs to manufacture arrests, padding their statistics, destroying lives so they could look good in performance reviews. That's not dedicated public service. That's corruption. That's criminal enterprise hiding behind badges. Chen's voice softened slightly, becoming more personal. I know what Mr. Brennan is asking you to do. He's asking you to side with people who look like authority figures, who wear uniforms, who represent a system you want to believe in. But that system only works if we hold everyone accountable to the same laws. If police officers can plant evidence, commit perjury, and walk away without consequences, then none of us are safe. Not Ms. Carter, not the 43 people who came before her, not you or your families or anyone who drives through a neighborhood where someone decides they don't belong. She gestured toward Naomi without looking at her. Ms. Carter didn't create this situation. She documented it. She had the courage to let herself be arrested, to spend hours in a cell, to endure public scrutiny and death threats, all so that the truth about these officers could finally come to light. That's not manipulation. That's heroism. And the only just verdict, the only verdict supported by the evidence, is not guilty. Chen sat down, and the courtroom fell into silence. Judge Morrison reviewed her notes before addressing the jury with instructions that covered the relevant law, the standards for evidence, the requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt. Her voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who'd delivered these instructions hundreds of times, who understood that justice often came down to how 12 strangers interpreted words like reasonable and doubt and proof. You may now begin your deliberations, Judge Morrison concluded. Bailiff, please escort the jury to the deliberation room. They filed out slowly, 12 people carrying the weight of a decision that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. Naomi watched them go, trying to read their faces, trying to predict which way they'd lean, knowing that prediction was pointless, but unable to stop herself from trying. How long do you think? She asked Chen as the courtroom began to empty. Could be hours, could be days. With evidence this clear, I'd expect quick deliberation, but Brennan planted enough doubt that they might argue for a while. Webb appeared at their table, his expression unreadable. There's a development you need to know about. Morrison's attorney just contacted the U.S. Attorney's office. He wants to make a deal. Naomi felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of deal? Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. He's willing to testify against Hastings, provide details about how long they've been doing this, name other officers involved. He's offering to blow up the entire precinct. Will the U.S. Attorney take it? Chen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. They're considering it. Morrison's testimony could help overturn dozens of wrongful convictions. It could lead to criminal charges against supervisors who knew what was happening and looked the other way. But it means he'd serve maybe 5 years instead of 20. Naomi's hands clenched into fists under the table. He destroyed people's lives. He sent innocent people to prison. And he gets 5 years? Justice isn't always satisfying, Webb said quietly. Sometimes you have to choose between punishing one person fully or using them to punish many people partially. The U.S. Attorney thinks Morrison's cooperation is worth more than his incarceration. What about Hastings? He's refusing to cooperate. His lawyer thinks they can beat the charges somehow, claim Morrison was the bad apple, and Hastings was just following his partner's lead. It won't work, but they're going to try. The afternoon stretched into evening as they waited in a conference room adjacent to the courtroom, eating takeout that none of them wanted, making small talk that died quickly, watching the clock advance with agonizing slowness. At 6 o'clock, word came that the jury had requested to review the video evidence again, which Webb interpreted as a good sign. They're making sure they saw what they think they saw. If they were leaning toward conviction, toward guilty on the original charges against you, they wouldn't need to review it. At 8:30, Judge Morrison sent word that deliberations would continue until 10, at which point the jury would be sequestered overnight if they hadn't reached a verdict. Naomi stood by the window watching the city lights come on across the downtown skyline, thinking about parallel universes where she'd made different choices, where she'd never agreed to this operation, where she was living a normal life untouched by courtrooms and corrupt police and the weight of representing something larger than herself. At 9:45, Chen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and stood abruptly. Jury's back. They've reached a verdict. The walk back to the courtroom felt surreal, time moving both too fast and too slowly, the corridor seeming longer than it had that morning. Other people had gotten word somehow, reporters, legal observers, protesters from both sides, and they crowded into the gallery, filling every available seat, standing along the walls where the bailiff allowed it. Naomi took her seat at the defense table, her heart hammering despite her training in emotional control, despite knowing that panic served no useful purpose. The jury filed in looking exhausted, their faces giving nothing away, taking their seats with the careful movements of people who'd been sitting in the same room arguing for hours. Judge Morrison entered last, surveying the packed courtroom before taking her seat. I understand the jury has reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged white woman who worked in hospital administration, stood with a piece of paper trembling slightly in her hands. We have, Your Honor. Please hand it to the bailiff. The bailiff carried the verdict form to Judge Morrison, who reviewed it without expression before handing it back. The defendant will please rise. Naomi stood, Chen beside her, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom, hearing nothing except the blood rushing in her ears and the judge's voice reading words that would determine everything that came next. On the charge of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, how do you find? The foreperson's voice wavered slightly but carried clearly through the silent courtroom. We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted, cheers from supporters, gasps from others, the bang of Judge Morrison's gavel demanding order. Naomi felt Chen's arms around her, felt her own knees weakening with relief so profound it was almost painful, felt tears she'd held back for weeks finally breaking through her control. Order, Judge Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. I will have order in this courtroom or I will clear it entirely. The noise subsided to whispers and shuffling. Judge Morrison looked at Naomi with an expression that might have been approval or might have been simple acknowledgement of a verdict correctly rendered. Ms. Carter, you are free to go. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled. This court apologizes for your ordeal and commends your courage in exposing corruption within our law enforcement community. She turned to where Hastings and Morrison sat, both looking pale and diminished. Officers Hastings and Morrison, you are hereby ordered to surrender your badges and weapons. The U.S. Attorney's Office has informed me that federal charges will be filed against both of you within the week. You are both released on bond pending those proceedings. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time, and suddenly people were pressing forward, reporters shouting questions, supporters trying to reach Naomi through the crowd. Webb and two other agents materialized around her, creating a protective barrier, guiding her toward a side exit while Chen handled the media with practiced deflection. They emerged into the cool night air through a service entrance, away from the crowds and cameras. A black SUV waited with engine running, and they were inside and moving before the reporters realized they'd missed their chance for interviews. How do you feel? Webb asked as they navigated through downtown traffic. Naomi laughed, the sound carrying an edge of hysteria she couldn't quite control. I don't know. Relief? Vindication? Exhaustion? All of it at once? The U.S. Attorney wants to meet tomorrow. Morrison's testimony is going to open up cases spanning 5 years. We're looking at potentially 100 wrongful convictions, maybe more. 100 people, Naomi repeated softly. 100 lives destroyed because 2 cops wanted better performance reviews. Not just destroyed, Chen interjected from the front seat. We can fix this. Appeals, pardons, compensation. It won't give them back the years they lost, but it's something. The SUV pulled up to the safe house, but Naomi didn't immediately get out. She sat in the darkness thinking about those 100 people, about the woman who'd taken a plea deal because fighting seemed impossible, about the man serving 15 years for drugs that had been planted, about all the victims who'd never have their day in court because they'd already been processed through a system designed to make resistance futile. I want to meet them, she said. The victims. The people who were framed. I want to look them in the eye and tell them what we're doing to make it right. Webb nodded slowly. We can arrange that. But Naomi, you need to understand, some of them are going to be angry. At you, at us, at a system that took years to fix what should never have been broken. They've lost time with their families, missed their children growing up, had their lives put on hold while we built a case. The fact that justice eventually came won't erase that damage. I know, Naomi said. But they deserve to hear it from someone who understands what those officers did, who experienced it firsthand even if I had the privilege of federal protection they didn't have. They deserve to know someone fought for them. She finally stepped out of the SUV into the night air, breathing deeply, feeling the weight beginning to lift even as new responsibilities settled onto her shoulders. The trial was over. The verdict was in. Justice, imperfect and delayed but real nonetheless, had been served. Inside the safe house, her phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from colleagues, interview requests from media outlets, threats from people who believed she'd destroyed good officers' lives. She ignored them all except one, a text from an unknown number that read simply, "Thank you for fighting. You gave me hope that the system can still work." Marcus Williams, victim number 17. Naomi stared at the message for a long time, thinking about Marcus Williams and the other 42 people whose names she'd memorized, whose faces haunted her during the hours she couldn't sleep. She'd won her own freedom tonight, but the larger battle, overturning their convictions, forcing systemic reform, ensuring this could never happen again, that battle was just beginning. Chen had joined her inside, laptop already open, pulling up case files and legal precedents. We need to prioritize the appeals, the ones serving the longest sentences first, then work our way down. Some of these cases are going to be straightforward. Morrison's testimony plus the evidence tampering will be enough to overturn them. Others are more complicated, especially the ones where physical evidence was destroyed or where the defendants took plea deals that technically bar appeals. How long until people start getting released? If we move fast and the courts cooperate, First releases could happen within weeks. But the process of clearing all the convictions, getting compensation awarded, holding everyone accountable who should be held accountable, that's years of work, Naomi. Years of legal battles and bureaucratic fights and resistance from people who don't want to admit the system failed this badly. Naomi pulled up her own laptop, opening a document she'd been keeping since the investigation began. A list of reforms that needed to happen to prevent future corruption, body cameras that couldn't be disabled, independent oversight of evidence rooms, automatic review of any case where drugs were found during a search the defendant didn't consent to, penalties for prosecutors who withheld evidence or coerced plea deals, a complete restructuring of how police performance was measured so that arrest numbers no longer determine promotions and bonuses. "Can I ask you something?" Chen said, looking up from her screen. "Was it worth it? Letting yourself be arrested, going through the trial, enduring everything that came with it?" Naomi considered the question carefully, thinking about the holding cell and the handcuffs and the hours of testimony, about the death threats and public scrutiny, about watching Morrison's face when the video played and knowing that her decision to become the evidence had made that moment possible. "Ask me again in 5 years," she finally said. "When we've freed everyone who can be freed, reformed what can be reformed, held accountable everyone who can be held accountable, then I'll know if it was worth it." Outside, the rain started again, drops hitting the windows in patterns that sounded like applause or tears, or perhaps both at once. Naomi sat in the safe house surrounded by legal documents and case files, planning the next phase of a battle she'd won, but that wasn't over, feeling the weight of responsibility and purpose in equal measure. The verdict had come in. Not guilty. 2 words that should have meant everything, but that actually meant the work could finally begin. The real work of transforming outrage into action, of turning one woman's vindication into justice for everyone who'd been victimized by a system that had learned to prey on the vulnerable. Tomorrow, she would meet with the U.S. Attorney. Tomorrow, she would start the process of appeals and pardons and reforms. Tomorrow, the media would want her story. Activists would want her support. Victims would want her help. But tonight, for these few hours, Naomi Carter sat in the darkness of a safe house and let herself feel what she'd denied herself permission to feel throughout the entire ordeal. The fear she'd suppressed, the anger she'd channeled, the hope she'd guarded like a flame in a windstorm that justice might actually be possible if someone was willing to fight hard enough for it. The trap had closed. The verdict was in. And the real work of dismantling a corrupt system had finally begun. Morning came with headlines that Naomi had expected, but that still felt surreal to see in print. FBI operative exonerated after exposing police corruption, read the Times. Video evidence leads to not guilty verdict in landmark case, declared the Post. Beneath the headlines were photos of her leaving the courthouse, of Hastings and Morrison looking diminished in their dress uniforms, of protesters celebrating or mourning depending on which side of the barricades they'd stood behind. Chen arrived at 7 with breakfast neither of them would eat, and a schedule that made Naomi's exhaustion seem irrelevant. U.S. Attorney's Office at 9, press conference at 11 if you're willing to do it. Your choice, but Webb thinks it would help frame the narrative before someone else does. Then this afternoon we start the appeals process for the first batch of victims. "I'll do the press conference," Naomi said, knowing that her face and voice would carry more weight than any written statement, that the public needed to see her as human, rather than as the abstract concept the media had been constructing for the past week. "But I want to say what I want to say, not read from talking points. Wouldn't have it any other way. Just remember that everything you say will be analyzed, quoted, and probably taken out of context by someone with an agenda. Be clear, be direct, and don't let them bait you into saying something that undermines the larger mission." The U.S. Attorney's Office occupied 3 floors of a federal building downtown, all polished marble and American flags, and the kind of institutional gravitas designed to remind everyone who entered that justice was serious business conducted by serious people. U.S. Attorney Catherine Martinez was a woman in her late 40s, with gray-streaked black hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen enough corruption to be unsurprised by any of it, but still angry enough to fight. "Ms. Carter," she said, shaking Naomi's hand with a grip that was firm without being performative. "Thank you for your patience with this process. What you've done is going to have repercussions far beyond this case." They sat in a conference room with Webb and Chen, plus 3 attorneys from Martinez's office who'd been assigned to handle the wrongful conviction cases. The table was covered with file folders, each representing a person whose life had been interrupted or destroyed by Hastings and Morrison's manufactured arrests. "Officer Morrison's attorney contacted us last night," Martinez began. "He's willing to provide full testimony in exchange for a plea agreement that would see him serve 7 years with possibility of parole after 5. He's prepared to detail every arrest he and Hastings fabricated, identify other officers who were involved or who knew what was happening, and testify against his partner in court." 7 years, Naomi repeated, her voice flat. "For how many lives destroyed?" 93 arrests over 5 years where we can prove evidence tampering. Probably more that we can't prove definitively. I understand your anger, Ms. Carter. I share it. But Morrison's cooperation will help us overturn those convictions and potentially bring charges against supervisors who enabled this behavior. We have to weigh punishment against utility. What about Hastings? He's refusing to cooperate, which means he'll face the full weight of federal charges. Evidence tampering, false imprisonment, civil rights violations, conspiracy. We're looking at 25 to 30 years if convicted, and with the video evidence and Morrison's testimony, conviction is essentially guaranteed. One of Martinez's attorneys, a younger man named David Park, pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. "We've categorized the victims by priority. Those serving the longest sentences, those who maintained their innocence throughout, those whose cases have the clearest evidence of tampering. We're filing motions today to vacate convictions for the first 12. If the courts move quickly, some of these people could be released within weeks." Naomi studied the names on the screen, committing them to memory. Marcus Williams, serving 15 years for possession with intent to distribute, maintained innocence from day one. Keisha Thompson, 10 years into a 12-year sentence, 4 children who'd grown up visiting their mother in prison. Roberto Sanchez, 8 years served, lost his business and his marriage while incarcerated. Each name represented a story of injustice that had been invisible until her arrest made it impossible to ignore. "I want to meet them," Naomi said. "When they're released. I want to be there." Martinez nodded slowly. "We can arrange that, but Ms. Carter, you need to prepare yourself for the reality that some of these people are going to be angry at you, at us, at a system that took years to correct mistakes that should never have happened. Getting exonerated doesn't give them back the time they lost." "I know, but they deserve to hear from someone who understands what those officers did, who experienced it even if I had advantages they didn't. They deserve acknowledgement." The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering legal strategy, timeline projections, and the broader investigation that Webb's team was conducting into police practices across the entire county. The corruption went beyond Hastings and Morrison. Preliminary evidence suggested quotas for drug arrests were official policy, that supervisors knew about evidence tampering and either participated or looked the other way, that the entire precinct had created a culture where manufacturing arrests became routine. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," Webb warned as they prepared to leave for the press conference. "When the full scope comes out, when people realize how systemic this was, there's going to be calls for everyone's resignation from the chief on down. Political careers will end. Some people will face criminal charges. Others will just be forced out. It's going to be chaos." "Good," Naomi said simply. "Maybe chaos is what's needed to force real change." The press conference was held in a courtyard outside the federal building, reporters and cameras arranged in rows that stretched back to the street. Naomi stood at a podium with Martinez and Webb flanking her, Chen slightly behind, presenting a united front of federal authority and vindicated victim. The questions came fast and aggressive, shouted over each other, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Naomi waited for silence before beginning to speak, letting the crowd settle, establishing control through patience rather than volume. "My name is Naomi Carter, and 10 days ago I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. Officers Derek Hastings and Kyle Morrison pulled me over in Harrington Hills, claimed my taillight was broken when it wasn't, searched my vehicle without consent, and planted 3 ounces of cocaine under my driver's seat. They arrested me, booked me, and filed charges that could have sent me to prison for 20 years. Yesterday, a jury found me not guilty because video evidence showed exactly what happened. Not speculation, not he said, she said, but clear footage of Officer Morrison placing drugs in my car and then pretending to discover them. She paused, making eye contact with several reporters, ensuring her words would be captured accurately. I want to be clear about something. What happened to me was not unique. It was not an isolated incident. It was standard procedure for officers who've been doing this for years, who've destroyed 93 lives that we know about and probably more that we can't yet prove. The only difference between me and the other victims is that I had the training and resources to fight back. Most people don't have that privilege. A reporter shouted a question about whether this was entrapment, whether she deliberately provoked the officers. Naomi addressed it directly. I was conducting research on traffic stop patterns in affluent neighborhoods. I was driving legally, following all traffic laws, doing nothing that should have attracted police attention. The only thing suspicious about my presence was the color of my skin. Officers Hastings and Morrison made a choice to stop me, to search my vehicle illegally, to plant evidence, and to lie about it in their reports and in court. Those were their decisions, not mine. I didn't force them to commit crimes. I documented the crimes they chose to commit. Another reporter asked about the broader implications, about reform. Naomi felt her voice strengthen, felt the purpose that had sustained her through the trial crystallizing into something she could articulate clearly. This case is about more than two corrupt officers. It's about a system that incentivizes arrests over justice, that measures police performance by numbers rather than actual public safety, that allows officers to operate without meaningful oversight or accountability. Until we reform that system, until we have truly independent oversight, until we eliminate quotas and arrest targets, until we make it impossible for officers to tamper with evidence or file false reports without immediate consequences, this will keep happening. Different cities, different officers, same pattern of corruption. The questions continued for 20 minutes, some hostile, some sympathetic, all of them seeking angles and narratives that would fit their publication's editorial stance. Naomi answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't, and maintained her composure even when reporters tried to bait her into saying something inflammatory about law enforcement generally. When the press conference finally ended, Martinez pulled her aside. "You did well. That's going to play nationally, which means pressure on other jurisdictions to investigate their own practices. You've started something bigger than you probably realize." Over the next 3 weeks, the dominoes began to fall with accelerating speed. Morrison's plea deal was finalized, and his testimony before a grand jury led to indictments against his former partner and 3 supervisors who'd known about the evidence tampering and either participated or ignored it. Hastings was arrested at his home, the video of him being led away in handcuffs playing on every news channel, a reversal of fortune that felt karmic even if it couldn't undo the damage he'd caused. The first exonerations came through faster than anyone expected. Marcus Williams walked out of prison on a Tuesday morning after 15 years inside, blinking in sunlight that seemed too bright after years of fluorescent lights and concrete yards. Naomi was waiting for him at the gates, along with Chen and a legal team that would help him navigate the complexities of re-entry. "Mr. Williams," Naomi said, extending her hand, "my name is Naomi Carter. I'm the person whose arrest exposed what happened to you." Marcus Williams was 52 years old but looked older, prison having aged him in ways that went beyond gray hair and lined face. He studied Naomi for a long moment before taking her hand, his grip tentative, as if he'd forgotten how to touch people in contexts that weren't violent or transactional. "They told me about you," he said, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone who'd learned not to feel too much because feeling led to pain. "Said you worked for the FBI, that you got yourself arrested on purpose to catch them dirty cops." "That's accurate. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you lost 15 years because of their corruption." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink away. "My daughter was 7 when they took me. She's 22 now. Got kids of her own I never met. My wife remarried 6 years ago. Can't blame her for that. Can't expect someone to wait forever for a man who might never get out. I missed everything, Ms. Carter. Everything that mattered. I know. And I know that no amount of compensation or apology can give you back that time. But we're going to make sure you get everything you're entitled to. Financial compensation, expungement of your record, support services for reintegration." And we're going to make sure the officers who did this face consequences. They should have death penalty for what they did, Marcus said quietly. Maybe that makes me a bad person for thinking it, but they killed me. Not my body, but everything that made life worth living. They killed that. And they did it for what? To pad their arrest numbers? To get promotions? Naomi had no answer that would satisfy that question, so she didn't try to offer one. Instead, she helped Marcus Williams navigate his first hours of freedom, connecting him with his daughter, who'd agreed to meet him despite the complicated emotions that 15 years of absence had created, ensuring he had housing and resources, and the contact information for counselors who specialized in helping exonerees adjust to a world that had moved on without them. Over the following weeks, more people were released. Keisha Thompson emerged from prison to a reunion with her 4 children that made everyone present weep, the youngest not remembering her mother except from prison visits that had become increasingly infrequent as the children grew and built lives that didn't include someone locked away. Roberto Sanchez found his business sold, his marriage ended, his reputation destroyed by a conviction that was now officially recognized as false, but that still lingered in the minds of everyone who'd known him before. Each release was bittersweet, justice arriving too late to prevent damage, but still arriving, still mattering, still making the difference between continued incarceration and freedom, however complicated that freedom might be. The lawsuits began almost immediately. 93 former defendants, now exonerated, filed civil rights claims against the city, the police department, and the individual officers who'd framed them. The city's insurance company calculated the potential liability in the hundreds of millions of dollars and suggested settlement negotiations to avoid bankruptcy-inducing jury verdicts. Political careers imploded as the mayor and city council members who'd overseen the police department tried to distance themselves from corruption they'd either enabled or failed to notice. The police chief resigned, followed by 3 captains and a dozen supervisors whose oversight had been so negligent it bordered on criminal. Federal monitors were appointed to oversee department operations, implementing reforms that included mandatory body cameras that couldn't be disabled, regular audits of evidence room access, and the elimination of arrest quotas that had created perverse incentives for officers to manufacture crimes rather than prevent them. Naomi attended every hearing, every press conference, every meeting where victims confronted the system that had failed them. She listened to their stories, absorbed their anger, accepted their thanks, and their recriminations in equal measure. Some saw her as a hero who'd exposed corruption at great personal risk. Others saw her as someone whose privilege, federal training, hidden cameras, legal resources, had allowed her to escape consequences they'd been forced to endure. Both perspectives were valid, and Naomi didn't argue with either. 6 months after her trial, Naomi stood in the same courtroom where she'd been exonerated. But this time, she wasn't the defendant. Hastings and Morrison were being sentenced for federal civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Morrison's plea deal meant he'd already been sentenced to 7 years, currently serving his time in a medium-security facility 3 states away, kept separate from the general population because former police officers tended to be targeted by inmates who'd been brutalized by the system they'd once represented. Hastings had refused to accept any deal, had maintained his innocence even after the jury convicted him on all counts, had claimed during his trial that he was the victim of an FBI conspiracy to destroy law enforcement morale. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding him guilty, and now he stood before Judge Morrison, waiting to hear how many years of his life would be spent in the same kind of cage he'd helped fill with innocent people. The courtroom was full of victims and their families, people whose lives had been interrupted by Hastings's crimes, who'd come to witness justice being served even if it came too late to undo the damage. Marcus Williams sat in the second row with his daughter, their relationship still fragile but beginning to heal. Keisha Thompson was there with all 4 of her children, the youngest now old enough to understand what their mother had survived. Roberto Sanchez attended alone, his former wife having declined his invitation, their reconciliation one of the casualties that couldn't be repaired no matter how thoroughly the legal system acknowledged its mistakes. Judge Morrison looked down at Hastings with an expression that contained no sympathy. "Mr. Hastings, you were a police officer for 20 years. You took an oath to protect and serve, to uphold the law, to defend the constitutional rights of every person in your jurisdiction. Instead, you became a predator who used your badge as a weapon against the most vulnerable members of our community. You manufactured arrests to advance your career. You destroyed lives to meet quotas. You sent innocent people to prison while claiming to serve justice. Her voice grew harder. The presentence report recommends 25 years. I'm sentencing you to 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. You will serve every day of that sentence, and when you're released, if you live long enough to see release, you will carry the designation of convicted felon for the rest of your life. Just like the people you framed, just like the victims whose stories you dismissed as lies while you were the one lying under oath. Hastings stood rigid, his face blank, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him break. He was led away by federal marshals, and the courtroom erupted in applause that Judge Morrison didn't attempt to silence. Outside on the courthouse steps, Naomi stood with Chen and Webb, fielding questions from reporters who'd covered the case from her arrest through the final sentencing. The question that kept recurring was what came next, what she planned to do now that the immediate crisis had been resolved. I'm staying with the Bureau, Naomi said. There are other cities with similar problems, other precincts where corruption has become routine, other victims who need someone willing to do what I did. This case proved that accountability is possible when we're willing to fight for it. I intend to keep fighting. A reporter asked if she'd consider running for office, using her platform to effect change through legislation rather than investigation. Naomi smiled and shook her head. I'm not a politician. I'm an investigator. My skills are in gathering evidence, in documenting corruption, in building cases that can't be ignored or dismissed. That's how I can be most useful in this fight. Not making speeches from a podium, but doing the groundwork that makes those speeches necessary. The final question came from a younger reporter who'd been covering civil rights issues for a local alternative paper. Do you think what happened here will actually change anything nationally, or will this just be remembered as an isolated case in one city? Naomi considered the question carefully before answering. I think change happens in layers. This case changed things in this city. 93 people were freed, corrupt officers were imprisoned, reforms were implemented. But it also changed the national conversation about police accountability, about how easy it is for corruption to flourish in systems that don't have meaningful oversight. Other jurisdictions are now investigating their own practices because they don't want to be the next city dealing with mass exonerations and federal monitors. So yes, I believe this will have lasting impact. But sustained change requires sustained attention. The moment people stop paying attention is the moment corruption finds new ways to hide. That evening, Naomi returned to an apartment that was finally her own rather than a safe house maintained by the Bureau. She'd moved in 2 weeks earlier, slowly transforming the generic space into something that felt personal. Books on shelves, photos on walls, furniture that she'd chosen rather than furniture that came with federal housing. It was a small thing, having a home again, but it represented the return to a life that wasn't entirely consumed by the case that had defined her for the past year. Her phone rang with Webb's number. Turn on the news. Channel 7. She found the remote and switched on the television to find a special report about police reform legislation being proposed in Congress, inspired by her case, designed to create national standards for evidence handling and officer accountability. The legislation had bipartisan support, a rarity in the current political climate, suggesting that her case had touched something that transcended normal partisan divisions. We did it, Webb said, his voice carrying satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. Not just freed some people, not just imprisoned some bad cops, but actually changed the system in ways that might prevent this from happening to someone else. Might, Naomi repeated, catching the qualifier. Not will, but might. Systems are resilient. They find ways to resist change even when change seems inevitable. But this is a start, Naomi. A real start. And it happened because you were willing to let yourself be arrested, to become the evidence, to trust that justice would eventually work even when it seemed most broken. After the call ended, Naomi sat in her apartment thinking about the journey from that October night when red and blue lights had appeared in her mirror to this moment of tentative hope that maybe, possibly, things could be different. She thought about Marcus Williams trying to rebuild a relationship with a daughter who'd grown up without him. She thought about Keisha Thompson navigating a world that had changed dramatically during her decade of incarceration. She thought about Roberto Sanchez trying to explain a 10-year gap in his employment history to potential employers who saw the exoneration but still harbored doubts. The victory was real but incomplete. Justice served but unable to undo all the damage that injustice had caused. That was the nature of this work, Naomi understood now. You fought for accountability, knowing that accountability couldn't restore what had been lost. You pursued justice, understanding that justice was always imperfect, always arriving too late for someone, always leaving scars that compensation and apologies couldn't fully heal. But you fought anyway, because the alternative, accepting corruption as inevitable, allowing systems to prey on the vulnerable without consequence, was worse than any imperfect victory. The next morning, Naomi reported to the FBI field office for her first day back at work since the trial. Webb had a new assignment waiting, a case in another city where traffic stop patterns suggested similar corruption, where minorities in affluent neighborhoods were being arrested at statistically impossible rates, where evidence was appearing in ways that seemed too convenient to be legitimate. This one's going to be harder, Webb warned, spreading files across the conference room table. The officers are more careful. They've learned from cases like yours. Body cameras get conveniently disabled, recording equipment gets discovered, witnesses get intimidated. We need someone who can operate in that environment. Naomi studied the files, seeing familiar patterns, recognizing the same systemic failures that had enabled Hastings and Morrison to operate for years. When do we start? You sure you want to do this again, after everything you went through? Someone has to, and I know what to look for now, how they operate, what mistakes they make even when they're being careful. If not me, then who? Webb nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. Then we start next week. Different city, different officers, same corrupt system. You ready to go through it all again? Naomi thought about the handcuffs and the holding cell, about the trial and the death threats, about standing at prison gates watching exonerated people blink in sunlight they hadn't seen in years. She thought about the cost and the purpose, about imperfect justice being better than no justice at all. I'm ready, she said. Let's go catch some dirty cops. 6 months later, in a different city with different officers but the same fundamental pattern of corruption, red and blue lights would appear in Naomi Carter's rearview mirror again. She would pull over, place her hands on the steering wheel, and wait for officers who thought they'd found another easy victim in the wrong neighborhood. They would be wrong, just like Hastings and Morrison had been wrong. Just like every officer who believed their badge made them untouchable would eventually learn they were wrong. Because Naomi Carter had learned something during her trial that would guide the rest of her career. The system was broken in ways both obvious and subtle, corrupted by incentives that rewarded arrests over justice, protected by institutional loyalty that valued solidarity over accountability. But the system could be fixed, one case at a time, one corrupt officer at a time, one jury verdict at a time. It required patience and courage and a willingness to endure temporary injustice in pursuit of lasting change. It required people willing to become the evidence, to document corruption from the inside, to trust that truth eventually mattered even when lies seemed more convenient. Naomi had become that person, not because she was exceptional, but because she'd been given opportunities that others lacked. Training and resources and federal backing that turned her arrest from a tragedy into a catalyst. The least she could do was use those advantages to fight for people who didn't have them, to be the advocate that 93 victims had needed years before they finally got one. The work would continue. The corruption would persist in new forms in new cities. The victims would multiply until systemic change made their victimization impossible rather than merely punishable. But for now, sitting in that FBI conference room planning the next operation, Naomi Carter allowed herself to feel something close to hope. She'd won her case. She'd freed the innocent. She'd sent the guilty to prison. She'd forced reforms that might prevent future victims. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough. But it was something real, something tangible, something that proved accountability was possible when people were willing to fight for it. And she intended to keep fighting, for as long as it took, against however many corrupt officers needed catching, until the system finally became what it claimed to be. A system that delivered equal justice under law regardless of skin color, regardless of neighborhood, regardless of whether you had FBI training or just the stubborn belief that you deserved better. The trap had closed on Hastings and Morrison. New traps were being set for their counterparts in other cities. And Naomi Carter, the woman who'd let herself be arrested to expose corruption, was ready to spring them all. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and sentences. It was about changing a culture that had made injustice routine, about dismantling systems that protected predators while abandoning their victims, about ensuring that the next person pulled over for driving while black in the wrong neighborhood wouldn't become another statistic in a pattern of corruption. That work had only just begun. But it had begun, and that mattered more than any single victory or defeat. The road ahead was long. The opposition was entrenched. The victories would be hard-won and incomplete. But Naomi Carter had learned to be patient, to trust the process even when it seemed broken, to believe that truth eventually triumphed over lies when someone was brave enough to document the difference. She was that someone. And she wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot.